Now, one thing that can be confusing when you're getting started with Angular and when you're learning Angular is the versioning of Angular. It all started with AngularJS, or Angular 1 as it's also called, which was released a couple of years ago. This was the first version, and it was a totally different version of Angular that worked totally differently. Now, the Angular team found out that AngularJS, Angular 1, basically wasn't future-proof because of some fundamental flaws in the way it was written. And therefore, they completely rewrote it, and the result of that was Angular 2, which was released in 2016. Now, Angular 2 is a totally different framework than Angular 1, and nowadays, unless you have a really good reason, you shouldn't use Angular 1 anymore. But you actually also won't be using Angular 2 because there have been a couple of other versions of Angular as well. Angular version 3 was skipped for some internal reasons, but then we had Angular 4 and a couple of other versions, and then we arrived at Angular 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and so on. So we got a bunch of Angular versions. Now, all these versions, however, are the same frameworks. The only difference is between Angular 1 and 2. We just have that many versions because the Angular team releases a new major version every 6 months. But that does not mean that every 6 months the framework changes entirely. The opposite is the case. Instead, it just means that there is a clear release schedule, but the changes from version to version are pretty minor. Angular is very backward compatible. Indeed, it hasn't changed that much since Angular 2 was released. It actually has internally, but not regarding the code you write. And therefore it's super stable, and we only have those small incremental backwards compatible changes. Therefore, for that reason, we typically don't refer to Angular by its version number, but instead we just differentiate it from Angular 1, which is just called AngularJS. And all the versions from Angular 2 on and higher are typically referred to as just Angular. So the framework name is just Angular, and we have all those versions, but you can ignore that because Angular 12 is basically the same as Angular 11 and so on. And what you learn in this course applies to the latest version of Angular. So now with the definition of Angular and the different versions out of the way, let's simply dive into it and let's build our first Angular app. For that, we'll use the official Angular command line interface, CLI. And that is the recommended and best way of creating Angular projects because Angular projects are actually a bit more elaborate regarding their build workflow. There are a couple of files that need to be converted before they can run in the browser, and this CLI does all of that, and it also heavily optimizes our code so that we ship a highly optimized code version to the browser once we finally deploy our app, which we'll also do in this course in the end, of course. So the Angular CLI, and you can see all the steps you need to run on the left here, and these steps are the same for Windows and Mac. Now for them to work, you need one additional tool, that's Node.js. Node.js is a server-side language, and you might be wondering, what are we doing with it in this course? It's an Angular course, not a Node course. And you'd be right, we won't write any Node.js code here, but Node.js will be used behind the scenes by the CLI to bundle and optimize our project, and we'll use npm, the Node package manager, to manage the different dependencies an Angular project has. Dependencies are things like the Angular framework itself, but also some other libraries that framework uses. So you can simply download the latest version here by clicking on that button. In my case, it's 10.0, but that might differ for you. And you will get an installer for which you can walk, which will conveniently install Node.js and this npm tool on your machine. Once you finish the installation, we can run these commands, and we run them in our terminal or command prompt. Now here I'm on a Mac, therefore I use the normal terminal. If you were on Windows, you would open the normal command prompt. Possibly open that as an administrator by right-clicking on the executable and clicking Run as Administrator. to rule out some potential issues. But in the end, you should be able to simply run npm using that node packager, install -g to install it globally on your machine, at Angular/CLI at latest. At latest is optional, at Angular/CLI is not. So you absolutely need to run this. Now on Windows, this should just work. On Mac or Linux, you probably need to add a sudo in front of this to give yourself the right permissions. Hit enter, and now I'm prompted to enter my password. You may or may not be. And once you confirmed everything, now download the Angular CLI from this Node Package Manager repository and install it on your machine. Now, as you can see, you might get some errors in between, like I'm getting here. You may ignore them as long as it successfully installed the CLI, as you can tell by the output here at the bottom. So it added to, or it updated two packages, or added them if you installed it the first time, and you see CLI and the version installed. Now, the version can differ depending on the time when you installed this, by the way. The general functionality will not differ. So this did work. Now with that, we can create our first Angular project. And for that, in the terminal command prompt, first of all, navigate into the folder on your system, on your computer, where you want to create that project. You can go there with the cd command. This is a command which is available on Mac OS and Windows. And with that command, you can navigate to any folder which already exists, though. So it must be a folder which you already created. In my case, I'm going into the development teaching Udemy folder. But again, that is a path which I created ahead of time. Simply go into any folder where you have read and write access to. And once you're there, once you're in that place where you want to create your Angular project, you can create it with this ngnew command, which you also find on the official web page. So here in that folder where I want to create this project, I will now run ngnew, and then any project name of your choice, a new folder of that name will then be created in that folder where you're running this command. And I'll just pick my-first-app here as a name. You can pick any name, but it shouldn't contain any white space and it shouldn't contain the word test. But other than that, you are free to use whichever name you want. And then also important, add --no-strict here. A strict mode is a special mode in which we can create our projects, and we'll look at strict mode or at optimizing our projects later in the course. To get started and make it a bit easier for us, we'll start in non-strict mode here. And then you can hit enter, and this will create a new Angular project for you. Now you're then asked a couple of questions, whether you want to add Angular routing, and here you should choose N for no, we don't want to add it yet. We'll dive into it later in this course. And which style sheet format you'd like to use for writing your styling code. And here I'll use standard CSS, so I will confirm this default selection here for me, CSS. And now this goes ahead and creates a new Angular project. And as I said, we need this more complex setup because, for example, Angular uses TypeScript, a superset of JavaScript. So basically a language that looks like JavaScript and is compiled down to JavaScript in the end by that workflow, but we also offered some extra features. And to do that compilation, as well as a couple of other optimization steps, we need this more complex setup with all these dependencies. Now, once this finished successfully, and if it didn't, check out the lecture prior to this video here. I do share some common gotchas and fixes there. So once this finished successfully, we can navigate into that with the cd command and then the name of the project. In my case, it's my-first-app. And once you're in there, you can run ngserve to basically bring up a development server that will run your build and for development optimized app so that you can see it in the browser. The server runs on localhost 4200 by default. You see the output here. So you can simply go to the browser, enter localhost 4200, and you see something like this. This is just a simple starting screen provided by the CLI project. Welcome to and then some useful links to the official docs and so on. Awesome. Now, the screen you're seeing actually all might look something like this. The starting screen simply was updated with newer versions of the CLI. This does not impact what you learn or the version of Angular you're using. Everything you learn in this course is fully up to date with the latest version of Angular. I kept this course up to date in the past. I will do so in the future. It's only that starting screen that changed. Now, in order to follow along smoothly, attached you actually find the app component HTML file. And you can simply go into your Angular project that was created on your hard drive with the ng-new command, and there into the source folder, the src folder, into the app folder, then simply drag the attached app component HTML file in there and replace the existing app component HTML file you find in there with it. And with that, if you reload localhost 4200, you don't even need to restart the server. You find the same looking starting screen I have here. Again, that's just for you to follow along smoothly. We'll work on these files in the next lecture. So we'll dive into what you get there in this folder and what this app component HTML file actually does. This is just so that you can follow along without problems. Angular itself has not changed. It's just this starting screen. Now, this is our first application. Now we set this up. Of course, not too much is happening here. So let's edit this first step and do something more fancy with it and all understand what exactly the CLI created in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we created our first Angular app, but we haven't changed anything there. So time to do that. And for that, you need an IDE or editor where you write and edit your code. Now I'm using WebStorm here. WebStorm is a great IDE, great for Angular development, but it's not free. A great free alternative would be Visual Studio Code, which you can find on code.visualstudio.com. This is a great IDE and it is free. You can simply download and install it both for Mac and Windows. And then you can start developing Angular with that. Whichever IDE or editor you installed, you'll always have to open a new folder. In WebStorm case, it's just called open. And then simply navigate to the folder you created. So in my case here, it's my first app. Select that folder and open. And now it will load that folder and all the files into the IDE on your system. So in my case, it now looks like that. Now, this is the project loaded into the IDE. It's still indexing it here, but it'll be done in a second. And these are all the folders and files the Angular CLI created for you. This is your entire Angular project. Now, as I said, this might look intimidating because you got so many files in there. Most of these files are just doing some configuration work and you don't really need to touch them. One interesting file is the package.json file. Here you can see all the dependencies of your project, like Angular 6. And these are these third-party packages your project needs to run correctly. All dev dependencies are only required for development for this build workflow I was talking about. But we're here to edit our code, right? So let's jump into the source file because that is where our code is. E2E is for end-to-end testing. We'll ignore this. And node modules is where all these dependencies you see in the package.json file actually were installed. But we're interested in the source code, so let's go to source. Then we got a bunch of other configuration files. And then here, we got this app folder. And in this app folder, we see some other files. Of course, I'll dive into what they all do in detail in this course. And for now, let's open the app component HTML file. And here we indeed see something which looks deceivingly like what we saw in the browser. Remember, it's welcome to app and so on. We see that here too. By the way, make sure you keep that localhost 4002 process running. So that ngserve process you started here in the terminal. Make sure to keep that running. If you're done with development for the day, you can quit it with Ctrl+C and you'll get out of there. But as long as you are developing, you should keep it running because it will automatically watch your files and rebuild your project whenever you change and save something. Now, since I need to restart it, and I will actually restart it here in my IDE. There's a built-in terminal. It's the normal system terminal. So here I can also run ngserve to bring that back up. But back to the app.html file, we're outputting something here. And if we change anything here, like, hey, this is instead of welcome to, and we save that with instead of running, if we go back, you see it automatically updated, hi, this app. Now, one strange thing we see is that this app here, well, we actually see these curly braces and title in the app component HTML file. And therefore, we can also see some of the work Angular does here. Angular is, of course, not a tool to allow us to write static HTML files. We would need no framework for that. It allows us to mix static HTML code and dynamic things we want to output in that code. And actually, what we have here is one of these components Angular works with, the app component. A component also has a template, the HTML code, possibly has some stylings in the CSS file, though here, as you can see. And importantly, it has a TypeScript file. If we enter this is TypeScript. And this is now the definition of the component. This is what will be converted to normal JavaScript by the build workflow. And in this file, we see a couple of interesting things like add component. I'll come back to that and what in detail is happening here in the next module. We also see title equals app. Now, what's that? If we go back to the app component HTML file, we also saw title here, right? Between the curly braces. So an assumption would be that the title in the TypeScript file is related to that. So let's maybe change this to my app. And now if we save this, it recompiles. And if we go back, we see, hi, this is my app. Now, this might not be perfect English, but we can definitely see that something changed. And so-called data binding in action, of course, also a concept we'll dive in deeply in this course. This is how we can output dynamic content, and this could, of course, be content that is calculated dynamically or retrieved from a server in our HTML code. Now, interesting, if we right-click on the loaded page and inspect the page source, we don't actually see that code there. We just see a bunch of script imports at the bottom. That is our build code and the Angular framework code. The head tag here, and then this strange app root part. Now, app root is also something we see in the app component TypeScript file. Here, the selector. So it looks like this is basically like our own HTML tag we're creating. And that's indeed what's happening here. The page we're viewing here, to which this belongs, actually is this index.html file in the source folder. Here we also see app root. The script imports are missing because they are injected dynamically. Now, what Angular does in the end is we always load this page. Then we have these dynamically injected script imports. And these script imports will dynamically replace app root with our own component. And of course, we can have more than one component in Angular apps. Again, these are all things we'll dive into in this course. Now, that's all nice. Let's do something more fancy. Let's change title dynamically. So back in the app component, I'll actually get rid of the entire code in here. And I'll add an input instead, a normal HTML input, type text. Below that, I'll add a paragraph where I want to output, let's say, a name. Now, name is not something we define yet. We'll do so in a second. Let's go to app component, and let's change title to name. And I'll say Max here because that is my name. And if I save that, I go back. We see the input, we see the name. Now, I want to be able to enter something in the input and automatically change the name. We can do this with a tool provided by Angular, a so-called directive, which is called ngModel. Now, you'll learn the exact syntax throughout the course. For now, let's simply add square brackets, parentheses, ngModel, written like that. Make sure to get the casing correct. There is no dash in between or anything like that. ngModel in square brackets and parentheses on the input, and set it equal to name. So to the same name you're outputting here. Now, this is a so-called directive, and what it does is it basically tells Angular to listen to anything you enter here and store it in this name property, in this name model, but also, on the other hand, output the value of the name model in this input. This is what we're doing here. Now, if we save this, we don't see anything on the page, and if we open the developer tools, which you can simply do from the menu or with the shortcut, you reach it under View, Developer Tools in Chrome, and I strongly recommend using Chrome for this course since it has the best developer tools. So then we see here in the console part, there's an error. Can't bind to ngModel since it isn't a known property of input. So somehow Angular does understand ngModel. Now that's strange because I said it's built in, right? Angular is actually split up into multiple modules, sub-packages you could say. And we need to add them if you want to use a certain feature from them. And in this course, you will learn about the different packages and which features they contain. To add such a feature, we go to that other file we haven't had a look at yet, the app module. This is basically where we tell Angular which pieces belong to our app. And there we have to add something to imports, to import another package from Angular. So we need to import it at the top of the file because TypeScript always needs to know where things are. So we import something from, and it's at Angular/forms. This is one other package from the Angular framework. And from that package, we can import the forms module, written like this. So make sure to add this import. This is not an Angular feature, but a TypeScript feature. As I said, TypeScript needs to know where the things are. But now with that imported, we can add it to this imports array down here, which is not related to the imports up there. This is simply a feature understood by Angular, since it's part of an Angular module. And now it tells Angular that we want to import some forms features. And this directive we're using is such a form feature. So now if we save that, our app will rebuild. And once it is done, we can go back. And now we see our input, and there's Max inside of it. And if I start typing there, you see that the text below it automatically also updates. This is some magic done by ngModel. We'll dive much deeper into everything we learned here. But this is now our first app with some changes. Throughout this course, I'll often start with an empty project for a given section so that we can focus on the topic at hand in this section. So therefore, you can simply create a new project with ngNew, as we did it a couple of lectures ago. And I'll typically start with an empty app component HTML file. If I have a different starting setup, you'll find it attached to the lecture. So I'll always ensure that this is the case. But here, I'll now simply have this empty setup. We can now remove forms module from app module here, in case you added it, so that we really have a clean starting project. And now there's one important thing. In this course, I'll use the Bootstrap CSS framework to have some nice CSS styles out of the box without us having to write all these CSS styles. Now to add this, we need to install it. We need to download it. We can do this by quitting this development server with Ctrl+C and then installing it with this npm tool, this node package manager, by running npm install --save bootstrap, and now that's important, add free to install version 3, which is the version I use in this course. Now this will install it locally in this project, not globally, locally. Simply hit enter and it will download Bootstrap and store it in the node modules folder. Now that's one first step. But to be able to use it, we also need to make Angular aware of this styling package we want to use. And we do that in one of the config files, the most important one actually, the angular.json file. This configures the CLI object. We will not work in this project file throughout the course because the default setup is perfect and we need to change anything there. But one thing we do need to change right now is the styles we want to use by default. Here you got this styles array in this architect build node. Now it already has one entry, source styles CSS. This is a file you can use to find some global styles you want to use application wide. So you can enter any CSS code here and it will be used in every Angular component. But in my case, I will add another import prior to that source styles CSS import so that we could overwrite it within this file. And now here we point to node modules. So to this node modules folder we got there. And if you scroll down a bit, there are many dependencies because you also have dependencies of dependencies here. If you scroll down a bit, you'll see Bootstrap. And in there, you find a dist folder, a CSS folder, and there the Bootstrap CSS file, or to be precise, there also is a bootstrap.min.css file, just hidden a bit by my IDE. So we can enter node modules /bootstrap /dist/css/bootstrap.min.css and make sure that you got no typo in here. It's easy to miss the T or something like that. So make sure that you have a path like this. Once you added this path here, save your package.json file and rerun ngserver to load this new configuration. As I said, you don't really need to change anything else here. The default configuration should work perfectly. So once you're done, you can visit localhost 4200 and you won't see any tab there. Here in the head section, you will see that the styles CSS file is being imported. And if you go to sources, you should find that styles CSS file here. And in there, you will see that it's mentioning Bootstrap, which basically means that Spring worked and Bootstrap is included here. And with that, you know everything we do in the course will work and will have the correct styles. Now, one last change in the app component property we have here. With that, the starting project is prepared and always of a new module, and important, you also saw how you can add your own styles.